Windows cleaned with old newspaper come up without a single streak, and they stay clean for weeks longer than anything wiped with a shop cloth. That is not a trick of the light or a marketing claim. It is simple chemistry and simple mechanics. And country households in England relied on it for the better part of 200 years. I am Arthur Whitfield, and I grew up in the Yorkshire Dales, in a stone cottage with no double glazing, no cleaning cupboard full of sprays, and no money to spare on anything that came in a plastic bottle. My grandfather kept a stack of old newspapers by the back door for exactly one purpose, and that was cleaning glass. Every Saturday morning, rain or shine, he would fill a bucket, tear up the papers from the week before, and go round every window in the house. I watched him do it from the time I could carry the bucket myself, and by the time I was 10 years old, it was my job, not his. There was no theory to it back then, it was simply what worked, and it had worked for his father before him. I am sharing it now because most people under 60 have never once cleaned a window with anything, other than a bottle bought from a supermarket shelf, and they have no idea what they are missing. Somewhere along the way, glass cleaning became a product category instead of a household skill. Companies that sell cleaning sprays, paper towels, and microfiber cloths have spent decades convincing people that streak-free glass requires a chemical formula and a subscription to buying more of it every month. It does not, and it never did. The truth is that a folded newspaper and a bit of vinegar will outperform almost anything on the shelf, and it costs next to nothing because the material is already sitting in your recycling bin. What I am about to walk you through is not a theory, and it is not something I read on a website last week. This is a method that was tested across hundreds of English winters, in homes with no central heating and windows that fogged and streaked constantly from condensation by people who simply could not afford to buy their way out of the problem. It worked then, and I use it in my own home every single week now, so it still works today. Keep watching, because by the end of this you will understand exactly why newsprint does something that modern cloths cannot. And there are several steps most people get wrong that stop this method from working properly. The first thing to understand is why newspaper works on glass in the first place. Newsprint is made from short wood fibers pressed very thin, and that thin, slightly rough fiber structure acts almost like a fine abrasive when it is dry or barely damp. It is soft enough not to scratch glass, but coarse enough to lift dried-on grime, fingerprints, and the thin film of grease that builds up on windows from cooking and from hands. On top of that, the ink used in traditional newspaper printing has a slightly acidic quality, and that acidity helps break down the mineral deposits that hard water leaves behind on glass. Modern microfiber cloths are excellent at picking up dust, but they are almost too smooth for glass, and they tend to drag moisture around in a thin film rather than lifting it away, which is exactly what causes streaking. Paper towels are worse still, because most of them shed tiny fibers of lint that stick to damp glass and catch the light the moment the sun hits the window. Newspaper does neither of those things, provided you use it the right way. And that right way is what most people online get wrong when they try this and give up after one attempt. The second thing you need to get right is choosing the correct newspaper. Not every newspaper works equally well, and this matters more than people expect. You want ordinary newsprint, the matte, slightly rough paper used for the main news pages, not the glossy magazine inserts or the shiny advertising supplements that come folded inside on a Sunday. Glossy paper has a coating on it that behaves almost like plastic, and it will smear glass rather than clean it. If you press your thumb against a piece of paper and it feels soft and slightly fuzzy rather than slick, that is the paper you want. Older newspaper, a few days old, rather than fresh off the press, tends to work even better, because the ink has had time to set fully into the fibers, and there is less risk of ink transferring onto your hands or onto light-colored window frames. My grandfather always kept a small stack aside for a week or two before using it for cleaning, and that habit is worth keeping. The third step is preparing the paper correctly, and this is where technique starts to matter. Do not cut the newspaper with scissors, tear it by hand instead. A torn edge has slightly rough, irregular fibers sticking out along the tear line, and those fibers are what do the actual work of lifting grime from the glass surface. A cut edge is too clean and too smooth, and it will not grip the surface the same way. Tear each sheet into pieces, roughly the size of your two hands held together, small enough to control, large enough that you are not forever reaching for a fresh piece halfway through a window. Scrunch each piece loosely into a rough ball before you use it, rather than using it flat. because the crumpled texture creates more surface contact with the glass and helps the paper absorb moisture evenly instead of pooling it in one spot. The fourth step is the cleaning solution itself, and this is where a great many people go wrong by using either too much liquid or the wrong liquid entirely. You do not need a shop-bought spray of any kind. Mix 1 part white vinegar to 4 parts warm water in a bucket or a spray bottle. Nothing more complicated than that. Vinegar has been used in English households for cleaning glass since long before the Victorian era. Because acetic acid cuts through grease and mineral film without leaving any residue behind once it dries, for particularly dirty glass, especially windows that face a road or sit near a working fireplace. You can add a small amount of washing up liquid to the mixture first, no more than half a teaspoon per bucket, to break down heavier grease before you move to the newspaper stage. But that is only for the first pass on very dirty glass, and it is a step most people skip entirely, which is exactly why they do not get the same result I am describing. The fifth step, and this is where the method truly comes together, is the wiping technique itself. Dampen your glass surface with the vinegar and water solution enough to cover it evenly without water running down and pooling at the bottom edge. Take your scrunched ball of newspaper and wipe the glass using tight, small, circular motions, working in overlapping circles rather than long, straight strokes. This circular motion matters a great deal, because it is what allows the rough fibers of the paper to work into every part of the surface rather than simply dragging dirt from one side to the other. Work section by section, top left to bottom right, so you always know which part of the window you have already covered. You will feel the paper start to dry out and darken slightly with grime as you go, and that is exactly the sign that it is doing its job. The sixth step is knowing when to change your paper, because using one piece for too long is one of the most common mistakes people make. Once a piece of newspaper feels damp all the way through, or once it starts to fall apart in your hand, it has stopped cleaning and started smearing. Swap it for a fresh piece immediately. Do not try to stretch it further. My grandfather always said a job half done with a worn-out cloth was worse than not starting at all, and that applies here just as much as it did to any other household task. For an average-sized window, you will typically go through 2 to 3 pieces of newspaper for the wet cleaning stage, and that is perfectly normal. The seventh step is the finishing pass, and this is where the true streak-free shine comes from. Once the glass has been worked over with the damp newspaper, take a second, completely dry piece, and go over the whole surface again, this time using long, straight strokes rather than circles. Working from top to bottom, this dry pass lifts away the very last trace of moisture and any remaining ink residue, and it is the step that separates a good result from a genuinely professional one. If you skip this step and let the glass air dry on its own, you will end up with faint streaks as the water evaporates unevenly, which is the exact problem people are usually trying to avoid in the first place. The dry newspaper pass takes less than a minute per window, and it makes all the difference. The eighth step concerns hard water stains and mineral buildup, and this is where most modern products genuinely fall short. If you live in an area with hard water, or if your windows have been neglected for some time, you may see faint white cloudy patches on the glass, particularly near the bottom edge where water tends to sit and evaporate slowly. For this, increase your vinegar ratio to 1 part vinegar to 2 parts water for that section only, and let the solution sit on the glass for 2 to 3 minutes before you begin wiping. This extra time allows the acidity to properly soften the mineral deposits rather than simply pushing them around. Then follow the same damp circular wipe and dry straight wipe process as before. This is the second method I mentioned earlier, and it is where most people are genuinely surprised, because they assume mineral stains need a specialist descaling product, when in truth, vinegar has been softening limescale in English homes since long before anyone was selling a bottle, labeled specifically for the purpose. The ninth step is understanding the difference between cleaning mirrors and cleaning ordinary windows, because they are not quite the same task. Mirrors have a reflective backing sealed behind the glass, and excess moisture running down the back edge over time can damage that backing and cause dark spots to appear at the corners. When cleaning a mirror with this method, use a barely damp piece of newspaper rather than a fully wet one, and always wipe any excess moisture away from the edges immediately rather than letting it sit. The circular motion still applies, and the dry finishing pass matters even more on a mirror. because any residue is far more visible against a reflective surface than it is on a window looking out onto daylight. The 10th step is timing, and this is a detail almost nobody talks about, yet it changes the entire result. Never clean glass in direct, strong sunlight. Heat causes the vinegar solution to dry too quickly before you have had the chance to work it properly or to follow with the dry pass. And that fast drying is what causes the worst streaking of all. Choose an overcast morning or work on the shaded side of the house first, exactly the way households did in the days before anyone had the luxury of choosing when to do their chores around the weather. My grandfather always did the east-facing windows first thing, before the sun came round, and left the west-facing side until later in the afternoon. And there was a good practical reason behind that habit, not just tradition for its own sake. Now, I want to speak plainly for a moment about why any of this still matters. I am not against modern products because they are modern. I simply think it is worth knowing that the glass cleaning aisle of a supermarket did not exist in my grandfather's time, and people still had clean, streak-free windows every single week without it. What was lost was not the ability to clean glass properly, it was the knowledge itself. Quietly set aside, as something bought became easier to reach for than something learned. The newspaper was always there in the recycling, doing nothing, while people paid for bottles of blue liquid that do a smaller job for a great deal more money. That is really all this is, taking back a small piece of knowledge that never should have been forgotten in the first place. If this has been useful to you, there are more methods where this one came from. I share a new one every day, drawn from the same kitchen table knowledge my grandfather passed to me. The old ways are still here, quietly waiting. You simply have to know where to look.